My name is Hannah Miller, and the night my parents threw me out of their house was the night my childhood ended forever. Before that night, I was just a 16-year-old girl trying to figure out who I was. I worried about exams. I worried about fitting in at school. I worried about whether I would ever get into a good college. Normal teenage things. But one mistake changed everything. And in my parents' eyes, it made me unworthy of being their daughter. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everybody seemed to know everybody else's business. My parents, David and Rebecca Miller, were respected members of our church. Every Sunday, we sat in the same pew. Every Wednesday, we attended Bible study. My father served as a church elder. My mother led women's ministry events. To the outside world, we looked like the perfect Christian family. But inside our house, perfection wasn't encouraged. It was expected. From the time I was a child, I knew exactly what my parents wanted from me. Good grades. Good behavior. Good reputation. Anything less was considered failure. Especially for a girl. My parents often talked about morality, responsibility, and family honor. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I thought they were simply trying to raise me the best way they knew how. Looking back, I realized they cared far more about appearances than people. Including their own daughter. When I was 15, I met Jason. He transferred to our school during sophomore year. He was funny, kind, and unlike anyone I had ever known. For the first time in my life, I felt understood. Seen. Important. We became friends first. Then something more. At 16 years old, I thought I knew everything about love. Of course, I knew nothing. Young people often confuse feelings with forever. I was no different. A few months later, my entire world collapsed. I still remember sitting alone in a pharmacy bathroom staring at a pregnancy test. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I looked at the result once. Then twice. Then 3 times. Hoping it would somehow change. It didn't. Positive. I was pregnant. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I couldn't breathe. I remember sliding down the wall and crying until my eyes hurt. Not because I was ashamed. Because I was terrified. Terrified of what came next. Terrified of what my parents would say. Terrified of losing everything. Unfortunately, my fears weren't big enough. Because reality turned out to be much worse. When I finally told Jason, he looked just as scared as I was. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "What are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer. Neither of us did. We were children trying to handle an adult problem. And every possible future felt frightening. For weeks, I kept the secret. I wore loose clothes. Avoided conversations. Pretended everything was normal. But secrets rarely stay hidden forever. Especially in small towns. Especially in strict families. One evening, my mother found a doctor's appointment card hidden inside my backpack. I still remember the look on her face. Confusion. Then suspicion. Then horror. "What is this, Hannah?" My stomach dropped. I knew immediately. The secret was over. I tried to explain. I tried to speak. But the words wouldn't come. My mother already knew. And judging by her expression, she had already decided what kind of person I was. Within an hour, my father came home from work. My mother told him everything. The shouting began almost immediately. I had never seen him so angry. His face turned red. His hands trembled. He paced across the living room like a man who couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You embarrassed this family. My father yelled. Do you have any idea what people will say? Tears streamed down my face. I'm sorry. But that only made him angrier. Sorry isn't good enough. For the next 2 hours, they didn't ask how I felt. They didn't ask if I was scared. They didn't ask what I needed. The only thing they cared about was what the neighbors would think. What the church would think. What everyone else would think. At some point, I realized something heartbreaking. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about themselves. Finally, my mother stood up. Her face was cold. Emotionless. Almost like she was speaking to a stranger. Not her daughter. She pointed toward the front door. And said the words that would haunt me for years. You're no longer our daughter. The room went silent. I stared at her. Certain I had misunderstood. What? My voice cracked. My mother didn't blink. You made your choice. Now live with it. I looked at my father. Waiting for him to stop her. To defend me. To tell me she didn't mean it. He looked away. That hurt even more. An hour later, I stood outside with a small duffel bag containing a few clothes and less than $50. The front door closed behind me. And stayed closed. The cold November wind cut through my jacket. I stood there for several minutes. Waiting. Hoping. Praying the door would open again. It never did. The porch light eventually switched off. And just like that, I was alone. 16 years old. Pregnant. Terrified. Homeless. As I walked away from the only home I had ever known, tears blurred my vision. I had no idea where I would sleep. No idea how I would survive. No idea what the future held. But one thing became painfully clear that night. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had abandoned me when I needed them most. And although I didn't know it yet, that rejection would become the beginning of a story none of us could have imagined. Because 20 years later, the same parents who threw me away would come looking for the grandson they never wanted. And what they would discover would change everything. The first night after my parents threw me out, I barely slept. I spent hours sitting on a cold bench at a bus station, clutching my duffel bag and trying not to cry. Every passing car made me look up. Every opening door made me hope. Part of me still believed my parents would come back. That they would realize what they had done. That they would find me and bring me home. They never came. By sunrise, reality had settled in. I was alone. Completely alone. And for the first time in my life, nobody was coming to save me. Fortunately, a woman working at the bus station noticed me. She could tell something was wrong. After gently asking a few questions, she gave me information about a local shelter that helped young mothers and homeless teenagers. That shelter saved my life. The building wasn't fancy. The rooms were small. The furniture was old. But to me, it felt like safety. For the first time since leaving home, I wasn't standing out in the cold wondering where I would sleep. I had a bed. A roof. And people who treated me with kindness. Something my own family had failed to do. The shelter staff helped me enroll in support programs and connected me with counselors. Many of the girls there had difficult stories of their own. Some had been abandoned. Some had escaped abusive homes. Others simply had nowhere else to go. Listening to them made me realize I wasn't alone. We were all carrying invisible scars. And we were all trying to survive. A few months later, my son was born. I still remember the moment the nurse placed him in my arms. Everything else disappeared. The fear. The uncertainty. The pain. All of it faded. As I looked into his tiny face, I felt something I had never experienced before. Purpose. He was perfect. Tiny fingers. Tiny hands. Tiny heartbeat. And despite everything that had happened, I knew one thing immediately. I loved him. More than anything. The nurse smiled. "Have you chosen a name?" I looked down at him. And whispered. "Noah." For the first time in months, I smiled. Because Noah wasn't a mistake. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't something to be ashamed of. He was my son. And he was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Unfortunately, love doesn't pay bills. The challenges came quickly. Diapers. Formula. Medical expenses. Transportation. Every dollar mattered. Some days I skipped meals so Noah would have everything he needed. Some nights I stayed awake worrying about money. I learned how expensive survival could be. At 16 years old, while other girls worried about prom dresses and weekend plans, I worried about rent and baby supplies. The hardest part was continuing school. Many people assumed I would quit. Some teachers were supportive. Others weren't. A few students treated me like I was contagious. They whispered when I walked by. They laughed behind my back. Some weren't even subtle about it. One afternoon, while carrying Noah's diaper bag through a grocery store, I overheard two women talking. One of them looked directly at me. That's what happens when teenagers make bad choices. The other woman nodded. She ruined her life. I pretended not to hear them. But their words followed me all the way home. That night, after putting Noah to sleep, I sat beside his crib. Watching him breathe. Watching his tiny chest rise and fall. The apartment was silent. The world felt heavy. And for a few moments, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I regretted Noah. Never Noah. I cried because everything felt so difficult. Because I was tired. Because I was scared. Because I missed the life I used to have. Then Noah moved slightly in his sleep. His tiny hand reached toward me. And something inside me changed. I wiped away my tears. Took a deep breath. And made a promise. A promise that would guide every decision I made for the next 20 years. I gently held his tiny hand and whispered. "My son will never feel unwanted." The words weren't dramatic. Nobody heard them except me. But they became my mission. My purpose. My reason for getting up every morning. I didn't know how I would succeed. I didn't know how I would build a future. I didn't know how I would overcome the obstacles ahead. But I knew one thing. Noah would never experience what I experienced. He would never wonder if he was loved. He would never be abandoned. He would never be treated like a mistake. Because no matter how hard life became, I would be there. Always. And as I sat beside his crib that night, holding his tiny hand in mine, I realized something important. My parents had taken away my home. They had taken away my childhood. But they had not taken away my future. And one day, I would prove that. Not to them. Not to the people who judged me. But to the little boy sleeping peacefully beside me. The little boy who gave me a reason to keep fighting. The little boy who would one day make me prouder than I could possibly imagine. People often say that hard work pays off. What they don't tell you is how painful the journey can be before it does. The years after Noah was born were the hardest years of my life. Not because I didn't love being his mother. Because I did. Every single day. The difficult part was trying to be everything at once. A student. An employee. A mother. And somehow, still a teenager. Most days started before sunrise. While the rest of the city slept, I was already awake. I would quietly get Noah ready, pack my school materials, and prepare for another exhausting day. After dropping Noah off at a childcare program that helped young mothers, I would rush to school. Then I'd spend the entire day trying to focus on classes while worrying about bills. Worrying about childcare. Worrying about whether Noah was okay. My classmates were planning parties and talking about college applications. Meanwhile, I was calculating how many hours I needed to work just to buy groceries. It felt like I was living in a completely different world. After school ended, my second shift began. I worked at a small diner near downtown. The pay wasn't great. The hours were long. But it helped keep food on the table. For hours, I carried plates, cleaned tables, and smiled at customers even when my feet hurt so badly I could barely stand. Then after closing time, I often headed to my second job. Cleaning offices. Vacuuming floors. Taking out trash. Wiping down desks. Most nights, I didn't get home until after midnight. By then, I was completely exhausted. Yet somehow, there was still homework waiting for me. There were moments when I felt like giving up. Moments when the pressure became almost unbearable. One winter evening, I opened my mailbox and found 3 overdue bills. My electricity payment was late. My rent was due. And Noah needed medicine for an ear infection. I sat on the floor of my apartment staring at the numbers. No matter how many times I calculated them, the math didn't work. I simply didn't have enough money. For the first time in years, panic took over. Tears filled my eyes. I felt trapped. Broken. Defeated. I remember thinking, maybe everyone was right. Maybe I ruined my life. Maybe I'll never get out of this. Those thoughts scared me. Because once doubt enters your mind, it spreads quickly. Like a disease. That night, I cried harder than I had since my parents threw me out. Then I heard a small voice. Mama. I looked up. Noah stood in the hallway wearing dinosaur pajamas. His hair was messy. His eyes were half asleep. He walked over and climbed into my lap. What happened? I quickly wiped my tears. Nothing, sweetheart. He looked unconvinced. Then he wrapped his tiny arms around my neck. You'll fix it. I smiled sadly. How do you know that? His answer changed my life. Because you always do. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Because in his eyes, I wasn't struggling. I wasn't failing. I wasn't broken. I was his hero. The person who always found a way. And suddenly, quitting wasn't an option anymore. Not because of me. Because of him. Over the next several years, life remained difficult. There were missed meals. Sleepless nights. Constant stress. There were days when I felt completely overwhelmed. Days when every part of me wanted to stop fighting. But every time I looked at Noah, I found another reason to keep going. As he grew older, he never complained. Even when we couldn't afford the things other children had. He never asked why our apartment was smaller. Why our car was older. Why vacations never happened. Instead, he appreciated everything. Every meal. Every birthday. Every moment. And somehow, that made the sacrifices easier. By the time Noah turned 10, I had finally graduated. Something many people said I'd never do. Holding that diploma in my hands felt like holding proof that the impossible was possible. I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. But for the first time, I could see a future beyond survival. A future where Noah and I wouldn't have to struggle forever. A future where all those sleepless nights meant something. As I watched Noah cheering for me from the audience at graduation, I realized something important. The people who doubted me had only seen a scared 16-year-old girl. They never saw the woman she would become. And neither did I. Not yet. But the hardest years were slowly coming to an end. What neither Noah nor I knew was that our lives were about to change forever. Because the next chapter wouldn't be about surviving. It would be about building something extraordinary. For nearly a decade, my life had been about survival. Surviving rejection. Surviving poverty. Surviving exhaustion. Every day felt like a battle. Every month felt like a victory. But eventually, something changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was moving forward. The day I graduated from college remains one of the proudest moments of my life. As I walked across the stage to receive my degree, I spotted Noah sitting in the audience. He was 10 years old then. The moment our eyes met, he jumped to his feet and started cheering louder than anyone else in the room. Some people laughed. Others smiled. I nearly cried. Because that little boy had been with me through every difficult step of the journey. Every late-night study session. Every double shift. Every sacrifice. This diploma belonged to both of us. After graduation, I found a stable marketing job with a local company. The paycheck wasn't huge, but it was steady. For the first time, I could pay my bills without panic. I could buy groceries without checking my bank balance 3 times. I could breathe. But deep down, I wanted more. Not more money. More freedom. More opportunity. A chance to create something of my own. One evening after work, I sat at the kitchen table while Noah finished his homework. A business idea had been floating around in my mind for months. I had spent years learning marketing, branding, and digital advertising. I knew how small businesses struggle to attract customers online. And I knew I could help them. The problem was fear. Starting a business meant risk. And after everything I had been through, risk felt terrifying. That night, Noah noticed me staring at my laptop. "What's wrong, Mom?" I smiled. "Nothing." He raised an eyebrow. I laughed. "Okay, maybe something." "What is it?" I explained the business idea. Then I explained all the reasons it might fail. The competition. The uncertainty. The financial risk. When I finally finished, Noah looked confused. "That's it?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Mom, you've done way harder things than that." I stared at him. Then laughed. Because somehow, my 12-year-old son had just given me the confidence I needed. A month later, I launched my business. At first, it was small. Very small. Just me working from a corner of our apartment. No employees. No fancy office. No investors. Just a laptop, determination, and years of experience. The first few months were challenging. Then the first client arrived. Then another. And another. Slowly, the business began growing. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily. The kind of growth built on trust and hard work. By the second year, I had enough clients to hire my first employee. By the third year, I rented a small office. By the 5th year, the company was serving businesses across multiple states. Every success felt unreal. Not because I doubted my abilities. Because I remembered where I started. A frightened 16-year-old girl sleeping in a shelter. A young mother with nothing but determination. Now I was building something I once thought impossible. And through every step of the journey, Noah remained my biggest supporter. As my business grew, so did he. And honestly, Noah made parenting look easy. He was kind. Respectful. Hardworking. The type of kid every parent hopes to raise. His teachers loved him. His classmates respected him. And his grades were incredible. By high school, he consistently ranked near the top of his class. Teachers frequently called to praise him. Academic awards became normal. Scholarships started arriving. Every achievement filled me with pride. But what made me proudest wasn't his intelligence. It was his character. Despite everything we had been through, Noah remained humble, compassionate, grateful. He never forgot where we came from. One afternoon, when he was 15, I found him helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries. The next week, he volunteered at a community center. The week after that, he spent his allowance buying school supplies for children in need. Watching him grow into such a remarkable young man felt like receiving proof that all the sacrifices had been worth it. Our bond became stronger with each passing year. We weren't just mother and son. We were a team. A family. The family we had built together. Friday nights became our tradition. No matter how busy life became, we always spent Friday evenings together. Sometimes we watched movies. Sometimes we ordered pizza. Sometimes we simply talked. Those conversations became my favorite part of every week. As Noah entered his final years of high school, people often assumed I was his older sister. We would laugh about it. Then he'd remind everyone, "That's my mom. And she's the strongest person I know." Every single time, my heart melted. Because years earlier, I had made a promise beside his crib. A promise that he would never feel unwanted. And looking at the young man he had become, I knew I had kept that promise. What I didn't know was that our story was about to come full circle. Because after 20 years of silence, the people who abandoned us were finally about to return. And they weren't coming back for me. They were coming back because they had heard about Noah. 20 years can change almost everything. They can transform pain into wisdom, struggle into strength, and dreams into reality. As I stood in the corner office of my company overlooking downtown Columbus, I often thought about how different my life looked from the one people had predicted for me. At 16, most people assumed I would fail. Some thought I would never finish school. Others believed I would spend the rest of my life struggling. Even my own parents had written me off. But life has a funny way of surprising people. My business had grown far beyond anything I imagined. What started as a one-woman operation from a small apartment had become a thriving marketing and consulting firm with dozens of employees. We worked with clients across the country. Our revenue grew every year. Industry magazines occasionally featured our company. People often called me a success story. The word still felt strange. Because when you've spent years fighting just to survive, it's difficult to see yourself as successful. But there was one achievement that mattered far more to me than any business milestone. Noah. At 20 years old, my son had become everything I hoped he would be. And more. He was studying at one of the most respected universities in the country. Not only had he earned admission, he had earned a full academic scholarship. His professors praised him constantly. His grades were exceptional. His leadership skills were remarkable. And everywhere he went, people seemed to admire him. Not because he was brilliant, although he certainly was. Because he treated people with kindness. The same kindness that had carried us through so many difficult years. One afternoon, I attended an award ceremony at his university. The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, faculty, community leaders. When Noah's name was announced as one of the university's top student leaders, the room erupted into applause. I felt tears forming immediately. As he walked across the stage, confident and smiling, I thought about the tiny baby I once held in a shelter room. The child my parents never wanted to acknowledge. the grandson they had never met. And suddenly, all those years of sacrifice felt worth it. Every single one. After the ceremony, Noah wrapped me in a hug. "You okay, Mom?" I laughed through my tears. "I've never been better." He smiled. "You know, none of this would have happened without you." I shook my head. "You earned this yourself." "No," he said firmly. "I had someone who never gave up on me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because we both knew exactly what he meant. A week later, life delivered something I never expected. I was reviewing reports in my office when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it. But something made me answer. "Hello?" For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I heard a voice. A voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. My stomach tightened instantly. My heart stopped. Because I knew exactly who it was. My mother. I nearly dropped the phone. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was imagining things. 20 years. 20 years without a birthday card. 20 years without a phone call. 20 years without a single attempt to contact me. And now suddenly, she was calling. "Hannah." The sound of my name coming from her voice felt unreal. I sat down slowly. Unable to process what was happening. "Yes." Another silence. Then she spoke. "I wasn't sure this was still your number." I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the situation felt absurd. After 20 years, that was her opening line. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just small talk. "What do you want?" My voice was calm. Far calmer than I felt. The silence returned. Then she finally answered. "We heard about you." Of course they had. Successful businesses attract attention. University award ceremonies attract attention. Local news articles attract attention. And apparently, after 20 years, success had finally made me visible enough for my parents to notice. I stared out the office window. The city skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The life I built without them stood all around me. "What exactly did you hear?" My mother hesitated. Then she said something that made everything suddenly clear. "We heard Noah is doing very well." There it was. Not Hannah. Not their daughter. Noah. The grandson they had ignored for 2 decades. The grandson they never once tried to meet. The grandson they were suddenly interested in now. I closed my eyes. Trying to stay calm. Trying to understand why they were calling now. And deep down, I already knew the answer. People often become curious about success after they've missed the struggle. My mother continued speaking. "We'd like to talk." I didn't respond immediately. Because part of me was still trying to process the fact that this conversation was even happening. 20 years ago, they had closed a door in my face. Now they were knocking on one I had built myself. And for the first time in 2 decades, I found myself wondering something. Why now? Why after all these years? What could possibly make parents who abandoned their daughter suddenly want to reconnect? The answer, I would soon discover, had everything to do with Noah. And absolutely nothing to do with regret. For 20 years, my parents had been strangers. Not distant relatives. Not people who occasionally checked in. Strangers. They missed birthdays. Graduations. Christmases. Every milestone that mattered. When Noah took his first steps, they weren't there. When he started kindergarten, they weren't there. When he won his first academic award, they weren't there. When he got accepted into one of the country's top universities, they weren't there. For 2 decades, They had made a choice. And that choice was absence. Yet suddenly, after one phone call, they wanted to be part of our lives. At first, I ignored them. It seemed easier that way. After all, what was there to discuss? The past couldn't be changed. The damage couldn't be undone. But my mother kept calling. Then my father started leaving messages. Emails followed. Then letters. Each attempt became more persistent. And each attempt focused on the same thing. Noah. Not me. Never me. Always Noah. One afternoon, I finally agreed to speak with them again. Part of me wanted answers. Another part simply wanted the calls to stop. The conversation began awkwardly. 20 years creates a lot of silence. A lot of unfinished history. My mother spoke first. "We've been thinking about you." I nearly laughed. 20 years late, I thought. Instead, I remained polite. "That's nice." My father cleared his throat. "We know things weren't handled perfectly." I froze. Not handled perfectly. That was how he described throwing a pregnant 16-year-old girl onto the street. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Because anger wouldn't change anything. Still, I couldn't ignore what he had just said. Not handled perfectly. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. My father shifted uncomfortably. "People make mistakes, Hannah." There it was. The thing I had suspected from the beginning. They weren't calling to take responsibility. They were calling to minimize it. To shrink 20 years of pain into a simple misunderstanding. My mother quickly jumped in. We were under a lot of pressure. The church. The community. The situation was difficult. I stared at the phone in disbelief. Even now. Even after all these years. They were still explaining. Still justifying. Still searching for reasons. Anything except accountability. Then my mother finally said what she had been trying to say from the beginning. "We'd really like to meet Noah." There it was. The real purpose of the call. The reason they suddenly reappeared after 20 years. The grandson they had ignored before he was even born. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city skyline, trying to process what I was hearing. "You want to meet him?" "Of course we do," my mother said quickly. "He's family." The words hit harder than she realized. Family. 20 years ago, they had decided neither Noah nor I qualified as family. Now suddenly, he was family again. Convenient. Very convenient. After ending the call, I sat alone in my office for nearly an hour. Thinking. Remembering. Questioning. Part of me wanted to say no immediately. To protect Noah. To protect myself. Another part wondered if everyone deserved a second chance. Even people who didn't deserve one. That evening, Noah came home from the university. The moment he walked through the door, he noticed something was wrong. "You okay, Mom?" I hesitated. Then decided he deserved the truth. "Your grandparents called." He stopped walking. For a moment, he simply stared at me. Grandparents? The word sounded foreign coming from his mouth. Because it was. He had never known them. Never met them. Never even spoken to them. I nodded. "They want to meet you." Noah sat down slowly, clearly processing the information. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up. "What do you think?" I wasn't expecting the question. Because honestly, I didn't know. For 20 years, I had imagined never hearing from my parents again. Now they were asking for something I wasn't sure I had the right to give. A relationship with my son. The son they had rejected before he was born. I honestly don't know, I admitted. Noah nodded thoughtfully. Then said something that surprised me. If you don't want them in your life, I understand. I smiled. Because somehow, despite everything, he always understood. But if you think meeting them might help you find peace. He shrugged gently. I'm willing to listen. His maturity amazed me. It always had. Over the next week, my parents continued reaching out. Each message became more emotional. More urgent. More determined. They talked about lost time. Missed opportunities. Family connections. And meeting their grandson. Eventually, I agreed to a single meeting. Just one. Not because they had earned it. Not because they deserved it. Because Noah deserved the chance to make his own decision. When I told my parents, they sounded relieved. Excited even. They immediately began talking about finally meeting their grandson. About reconnecting. About family. As if 20 years could be erased with a handshake. As if old wounds could disappear overnight. But what they didn't know was this. They were expecting to meet a child. Someone who needed their approval. Someone who would be impressed by them. Someone eager to welcome them back. Instead, they were about to meet the young man their rejection had helped create. And what happened during that meeting would leave both of them completely speechless. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. For the entire week leading up to it, I felt a knot in my stomach. Not because I was nervous. Because I didn't know what to expect. 20 years of silence is a long time. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of pain. And now, somehow, all of that was leading to one afternoon. The meeting took place at a quiet restaurant near the university. Neutral ground. No family home. No emotional memories. Just a place where everyone could sit down and talk. When Noah and I arrived, my parents were already there. The moment I saw them, I was shocked. Age had changed them. My father's hair was completely gray. My mother's face carried wrinkles that hadn't existed 20 years ago. For a brief moment, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. Because time had moved forward for all of us. Even when we weren't together. My parents stood as we approached. Their eyes immediately moved past me. Straight to Noah. I noticed it instantly. The way they stared. The way they studied his face. Trying to find pieces of themselves in someone they had never known. My mother looked emotional. Almost overwhelmed. He's so handsome, she whispered. Noah smiled politely. Nice to meet you. My father extended his hand. Noah shook it confidently. I could see my parents exchanging surprised glances. I don't think they expected him to be so poised. So confident. So composed. We sat down. At first, the conversation felt awkward. Small talk. Questions about school. Questions about hobbies. Questions about life. The type of conversation relatives usually have after seeing each other for a few months. Not after 20 years. Then my father asked the question he had clearly been waiting to ask. So, Noah. Your mother tells us you're doing very well in school. Noah smiled. I've been fortunate. My mother leaned forward. What exactly are you studying? Business and public policy. Their eyebrows lifted. Noah continued. I also run a nonprofit mentorship program for disadvantaged teenagers. My parents blinked. Clearly surprised. Noah wasn't finished. The program currently operates in 4 states. Now both of them looked stunned. My father frowned slightly. You started a nonprofit. Noah nodded. 3 years ago. And you're running it while attending university. Yes, sir. The table went silent. My parents had expected an ordinary young man. Instead, they were meeting someone who had already accomplished more than many adults twice his age. Over the next 30 minutes, they learned even more. They learned that Noah had received multiple national scholarships. They learned he had been featured in local media. They learned he had spoken at leadership conferences. They learned universities across the country were competing to recruit him into graduate programs. Every revelation seemed to leave them more shocked than the last. I simply sat quietly, watching, listening. Because for years, people had underestimated Noah, just as they had underestimated me. And now reality was speaking for itself. Eventually, my mother wiped tears from her eyes. I can't believe all you've accomplished. Noah smiled politely. Thank you. Then she looked at me. For the first time since the meeting started. And something shifted in her expression. Perhaps for the first time, she was beginning to understand. Everything she had missed. Everything she had thrown away. Everything she had never bothered to see. My father cleared his throat. You've done incredibly well for yourself. Noah nodded. I appreciate that. Then my father asked a question. A question that would change everything. How did you become such an exceptional young man? The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Noah looked at him. Then looked at me. A soft smile appeared on his face. And when he spoke, his words hit the table like thunder. Because of my mother. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Noah continued. His voice calm. Steady. Confident. The woman you threw away became the best mother I could ever ask for. The entire table froze. My mother's eyes instantly filled with tears. My father looked down. Unable to meet Noah's gaze. For the first time since the meeting began, there were no excuses. No explanations. No justifications. Only truth. Noah continued. When everyone else gave up on her, she kept going. When people judged her, she kept going. When life knocked her down, she got back up. He looked directly at my parents. Everything I am today is because she refused to quit. Tears rolled down my mother's cheeks. My father sat completely silent. Noah wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. That was what made his words even more powerful. He wasn't attacking them. He was honoring me. And somehow, that hurt them more. Because they finally realized what they had missed. Not just 20 years. An entire life. A daughter who became extraordinary. A grandson who became remarkable. A family they could have had. If only they had chosen love over judgment. The silence lasted several seconds. Then my mother began crying openly. And for the first time in 20 years. I saw genuine regret. Not embarrassment. Not excuses. Regret. Real regret. But by then, all of us understood something important. Success hadn't shocked them. Noah had. Because standing before them wasn't the mistake they once feared. He was living proof that their greatest judgment had become their greatest loss. After Noah spoke, nobody at the table knew what to say. The restaurant noise seemed distant. Muted. As if the rest of the world had disappeared. My mother sat quietly, wiping tears from her eyes. My father stared at the table. For the first time since we arrived, neither of them had an explanation. Neither of them had a defense. Only silence. And sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Eventually, my mother looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as the pregnant teenager she remembered. Not as the daughter who embarrassed the family. But as the woman sitting in front of her. The woman she hadn't known for 20 years. Hannah. Her voice cracked. I'm so sorry. The words hung in the air. For years, I imagined hearing those words. I imagined how satisfying they would feel. How much healing they might bring. But when the moment finally arrived, I felt surprisingly calm. Because time had already done most of the healing. I smiled gently. Not out of happiness. Out of peace. You don't have to explain. My father finally looked up. His eyes were red. We were wrong. The words seemed difficult for him to say. Painful. As if admitting them required him to confront 2 decades of regret. I nodded. Yes. Nobody argued. Because there was nothing left to argue about. The evidence was sitting right there. Across the table. My son. Their grandson. Living proof that they had been wrong. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then my mother asked a question. One simple question. But it carried 20 years of history. Did you ever hate us? I thought about it honestly. There was a time when the answer would have been yes. A time when the pain felt unbearable. A time when anger was easier than understanding. But that time had passed. I slowly shook my head. No. Both of them looked surprised. I continued. There were years when I was hurt. Years when I was angry. Years when I couldn't understand how parents could abandon their child. My mother's tears returned. But hatred? I paused. No. The truth was simpler than that. I was too busy surviving. The table became silent again. Because those words carried a weight neither of them had fully understood before. They knew they had thrown me out. But they had never truly imagined what happened afterward. The shelter. The loneliness. The hunger. The fear. The endless nights wondering how I would provide for Noah. The years of working multiple jobs. The sacrifices. The struggles. The moments I almost broke. They had never been there to see any of it. And that realization was beginning to settle over them. My father swallowed hard. What was it like? I looked at him. For the first time, I saw genuine curiosity. Not judgment. Not criticism. Just regret. So I told them. Not to punish them. Not to make them feel guilty. Simply because they deserved to know. I told them about sleeping in a shelter at 16. I told them about studying during the day and working late into the night. I told them about skipping meals so Noah could eat. I told them about crying alone after everyone else was asleep. I told them about the fear. The uncertainty. The exhaustion. And through it all, neither of them interrupted. Neither of them defended themselves. Neither of them offered excuses. They simply listened. When I finished, my mother was openly crying. My father looked completely defeated. Then I said something that neither of them expected. I don't blame you anymore. They both looked up. Confused. I continued. Because blame won't give me those years back. It won't change what happened. It won't rewrite the past. The truth was painful. But it was still the truth. Then I glanced at Noah. Sitting beside me. The young man I had spent 20 years raising. The greatest blessing of my life. And suddenly, I understood something. If you hadn't made the choices you made. I smiled softly. I wouldn't have become the person I am today. My parents stared at me. Speechless. Not because I was forgiving them. Because I wasn't attacking them. After everything that happened, they expected anger, resentment, bitterness. Instead, I offered perspective. And somehow that was harder for them to face. My mother lowered her head. "We missed everything." The words barely escaped her lips. I nodded. "Yes." Her voice trembled. "The birthdays, school events, Christmas mornings, the graduations." More tears followed. My father covered his face with his hands, as if the weight of realization had become too much. Because they were finally understanding something they had spent 20 years avoiding. They hadn't just lost a daughter. They had lost an entire life. 20 years of memories. 20 years of laughter. 20 years of family dinners. 20 years of milestones. 20 years with a grandson who had grown into an extraordinary young man. Moments they would never get back. Memories they would never experience. Time that was gone forever. No amount of regret could change that. No apology could restore it. No explanation could undo it. For the first time, they truly understood the cost of their decision. And the hardest part wasn't what they lost. It was knowing they had lost it by choice. The table remained quiet. Finally, Noah reached across and gently placed his hand over mine. A simple gesture, but one that reminded me of everything that truly mattered. The family we had built. The love we had shared. The life we had created together. And as I looked at my parents, I realized something important. The truth they couldn't escape wasn't that they had made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The truth they couldn't escape was that one moment of judgment had cost them 20 years of love. And some losses can never be fully recovered. No matter how deeply you regret them. The meeting ended differently than I had imagined for most of my life. There was no dramatic confrontation. No shouting. No revenge. No attempt to make my parents suffer the way I had suffered. Just honesty. And sometimes, honesty is more powerful than anger. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade outside the restaurant windows as we sat together in silence. For the first time in 20 years, nobody was arguing. Nobody was defending themselves. The truth had already spoken for all of us. My mother looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. As if she had spent the entire afternoon carrying the weight of 20 years on her shoulders. My father seemed much the same. Older. Sadder. Quieter. Eventually, my mother reached across the table. Not far enough to touch me. Just enough to show she wanted to. "Hannah," she said softly. "I'm sorry for everything." Tears filled her eyes again. "We thought we were protecting our family." Her voice broke. "But we destroyed it." I looked at her for a long moment. Then at my father. Neither of them looked like the people who had thrown me out all those years ago. They looked like two aging parents living with regrets they could never erase. And for the first time, I truly understood something. They had suffered too. Not in the way I had. But in their own way. Because regret can become its own punishment. Especially when it lasts 20 years. I took a deep breath. Then smiled gently. "I forgive you." My mother's hand immediately covered her mouth. My father closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The words seemed almost too much for them to process. Because forgiveness was the last thing they expected. After everything. After all the years. After all the pain. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. And it didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. Some wounds heal. Others become scars. And scars remain. My father looked at me. "Do you think we can ever be a family again?" The question hung heavily in the air. I thought carefully before answering. Because the truth mattered. And the truth wasn't simple. Finally, I spoke. We can try to build something new. Both of them listened carefully. But we can't get those 20 years back. The words hurt. Because they were true. There would be no first birthday parties. No school plays. No Christmas mornings. No bedtime stories. No family vacations. No graduation ceremonies from elementary school. No childhood memories. Those moments were gone forever. And everyone at the table knew it. My mother began crying again. Not loudly. Just quietly. The kind of tears that come from realizing some losses can never be recovered. Then Noah spoke. His voice calm. Steady. Compassionate. The same way it had always been. I don't hate you. My parents looked at him. Surprised. Because they probably expected anger. Maybe even resentment. Instead, Noah offered something far more difficult. Grace. He smiled gently. But the reason I don't hate you is because my mom never taught me hate. My mother's eyes immediately filled with tears. And honestly, so did mine. Because in that moment, I realized something. Noah had become a better man than I could have ever imagined. Not because of his grades. Not because of his awards. Not because of his success. Because of his heart. My father wiped his eyes. Then looked directly at Noah. You deserved better grandparents. Noah nodded respectfully. Maybe. Then he smiled. But I had the best mother. The room became silent once more. And somehow, those words meant more than any award I had ever received. More than any business achievement. More than any recognition. Because at the end of the day, that had always been my greatest goal. Not success. Not wealth. Not proving people wrong. Simply being the mother Noah deserved. And hearing those words told me I had succeeded. Eventually, we stood up to leave. My parents hugged me. The first hug in 20 years. It felt strange. Unfamiliar. But not unwelcome. Then they hugged Noah. Their grandson. The boy they had never known. The young man they would spend the rest of their lives wishing they had known sooner. As we walked toward the parking lot, the evening sky glowed orange and gold above us. Noah walked beside me. Just as he always had. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he slipped his arm around my shoulders. Are you okay, Mom? I smiled. And this time, the answer came easily. Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I truly was. Because forgiveness had given me peace. Not closure. Peace. And there is a difference. As Noah and I drove home, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The frightened 16-year-old girl standing alone in the cold. The young mother struggling to survive. The woman building a future one day at a time. And the son who became her greatest blessing. Life hadn't unfolded the way I planned. In many ways, it had been harder. Far harder. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Because every difficult step had led me to Noah. And Noah had led me here. Final moral. One mistake should never define a person's entire future. People deserve compassion. People deserve second chances. And no one should be judged solely by their worst moment. Sometimes the people others give up on become the strongest, kindest, and most successful people of all. And sometimes, the greatest form of success isn't proving your critics wrong. It's building a life so full of love that their opinions no longer matter.